Imagine moving into your dream home only to have it turn into a nightmare the very first week. My wife was simply carrying boxes inside when our HOA president, better known as Karen of the cul-de-sac, decided it looked suspicious enough to call the cops. But what happened next silenced the entire neighborhood. When the officer approached, he suddenly froze, leaned closer to his partner, and whispered just one question. "Wait, is that Ghost Viper?" From that moment on, nothing in our quiet, gated community would ever be the same. We thought we were moving into peace. After years of renting cramped apartments near the base, my wife and I had finally saved enough to buy a home in what everyone called the nicest gated community in town. The streets were lined with perfectly trimmed hedges, mailboxes all identical, and lawns so precisely manicured you'd swear they had been cut with scissors. To outsiders, it looked like perfection. To us, it looked like stability finally. A place to settle down. I had left behind a past most people didn't know about. My wife knew, of course, but to everyone else I was just another homeowner trying to fit into suburban life. No one had a clue about the years of shadows and whispers, the kind of work that never made it onto a resume. And I wanted to keep it that way. The day we moved in, neighbors waved politely, but there was an edge in their smiles as though they were assessing whether we belonged. That was when we first met her, Karen, the HOA president, self-appointed, guardian of the cul-de-sac, and someone who believed every rule in the handbook was scripture. She was tall, sharp-eyed, and carried a clipboard like it was a weapon. She didn't so much greet us as she inspected us. Her first words weren't, "Welcome to the neighborhood," but rather, "Just make sure your grass doesn't exceed 3 inches. We've had problems before." My wife laughed it off at the time. She had always been the optimist between us. But I felt something different, an uneasy tension that reminded me too much of situations I had encountered in another life. The way Karen lingered, her eyes scanning every box the movers carried in, told me this wasn't a woman who was going to let us blend quietly into the background. Still, we tried to settle in. My wife decorated the living room, humming as she unpacked photo frames. I walked the perimeter of the house, noticing the rows of security cameras positioned at odd angles throughout the neighborhood. It felt less like a community and more like a compound. The first few days passed quietly enough. But as anyone who's dealt with a power-drunk HOA knows, peace doesn't last long when someone like Karen has you in her sights. She didn't like that my truck was parked too close to the curb during unloading. She didn't like the brand of trash bins we used. She didn't even like the way my wife set out a welcome mat, because it wasn't on her approved vendor list. Individually, these were small things, petty, even. But together, they painted a picture of someone looking for a fight. And in the back of my mind, I knew, if she pushed too far, she might stumble into a truth she could never unsee. That breaking point came faster than either of us expected. My wife was just carrying boxes one afternoon, minding her own business. When Karen decided she had seen enough, she dialed the police with a trembling voice, reporting suspicious activity at our address. What she thought would be a simple show of force from law enforcement turned into the moment everything unraveled, because when the officer arrived, he recognized me. And from that recognition, our quiet move-in days spiraled into a storm the entire neighborhood would remember forever. At first, I wanted to believe Karen's call to the cops had been a one-off burst of paranoia, a misunderstanding, maybe even some strange attempt at asserting control over the new neighbors. But I was wrong. It wasn't the end. It was the beginning. The very next morning, an envelope appeared on our door. Inside was a formal notice from the HOA citing us for improper unloading procedures. According to the handbook, moving trucks weren't permitted to block the street beyond a 30-minute window. We had gone 45. The fine? $200. $200 on our first week in the house. My wife was furious, but I told her to ignore it. Pay the fine, I said. It wasn't worth the fight. But deep down, I knew this wasn't about a truck. This was about control. Karen had locked onto us, and she wasn't going to let go. The fines kept coming. A warning for leaving cardboard boxes at the curb instead of breaking them down according to HOA standards. Another for a garden hose that wasn't coiled properly. Even the color of our porch light, apparently, it had a warm amber hue that wasn't on the approved spectrum. Each violation felt more absurd than the last, but Karen's persistence was relentless, and it wasn't just paper threats. She began circling our home in the evenings, clipboard in hand, peering over hedges and snapping photos with her phone. I caught her once, standing at the edge of our driveway, zooming in on my license plate as though documenting evidence. When I stepped outside and locked eyes with her, she didn't flinch. She just scribbled something down and walked away. The neighbors noticed too. Some of them kept their distance, afraid to be associated with us. Others offered hushed warnings. Karen's been running this HOA for years, one man whispered to me while taking out his trash. She's taken people to court over lawn ornaments. Be careful. But Karen wasn't the only problem. The HOA board seemed to bend to her will. Every complaint we raised, every attempt at reason, was met with the same rehearsed response. The rules are the rules. It was as if the entire system was designed to grind people down until they either conformed or left. For my wife, it became exhausting. What should have been quiet evenings unpacking and decorating turned into nights filled with stress and frustration. She started jumping at the sound of footsteps outside, worried Karen was prowling again. She began asking me if we'd made a mistake moving here, if the dream home wasn't worth the price of constant surveillance and harassment. And through it all, I stayed silent about the thing that mattered most, the reason Karen's call to the police had rattled me more than I'd shown. Because when that officer whispered, "Wait, is that Ghost Viper?" he hadn't been joking. He'd recognized me. Years earlier, before this quiet suburban chapter, I'd lived under another name in another world. A world of classified missions, untraceable operations, and skills that left scars both visible and hidden. Ghost Viper, that was the name I'd carried in those circles. A name never meant to touch a place like this. But now, thanks to Karen's paranoia, the past had brushed against the present, and the more Karen escalated, the more dangerous it became, not for me, but for her. Because while I wanted to keep my history buried, she was digging with reckless hands into ground she didn't understand. The tension finally snapped one afternoon when my wife came inside, her hands trembling. She'd been carrying groceries from the car when Karen approached her in the driveway, shouting accusations loud enough for the whole street to hear. "We don't know who you people really are," she screamed. "Your husband isn't who he says he is. The cops are already suspicious." My wife, shaken but steady, tried to walk past her. But Karen wasn't done. She pulled out her phone, recording the moment, and declared she was filing for a safety injunction against us. To her, it was just another tactic to drive us out. To me, it was something far more dangerous, because every police interaction was another chance for my old identity to resurface. That night, I sat at the kitchen table long after my wife had gone to bed, staring at the growing pile of HOA fines and notices. Each piece of paper felt like a spark tossed into a dry field. And Karen, whether she realized it or not, was playing with fire. The next board meeting was scheduled for the following week. Karen had already announced she'd be bringing up certain security concerns about us. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just harassment anymore, it was war. And if she thought she had the upper hand, she was about to learn the hard way what happens when you back Ghost Viper into a corner. The night of the HOA board meeting arrived like a storm cloud. The community center was packed tighter than I'd ever seen it. Folding chairs scraped the tile floor as neighbors settled in, clutching copies of the rulebook as if it were scripture. The air smelled faintly of burnt coffee and nervous sweat. Karen sat at the head of the long table, her clipboard stacked high with papers, her eyes glinting like a predator that had cornered its prey. She had prepared for this moment. For her, this wasn't just another violation or fine, this was a public trial, and she was determined to paint us as criminals hiding in plain sight. My wife and I sat near the front. She squeezed my hand under the table, her knuckles white. I could feel the tremor in her grip, the unspoken question in her silence. Are we really ready for this? Karen began with theatrics. She rattled off a list of supposed infractions, each one exaggerated more than the last. She accused us of breaking curfew rules, of violating aesthetic harmony, of causing disturbances with suspicious activity. Every word dripped with venom, and each sentence ended with her turning dramatically to the crowd for effect. The neighbors murmured, some nodding, others frowning. A few shot us pitying glances. Most, though, seemed captivated by the spectacle. Karen had always been good at bending the narrative to her favor, and tonight she had set the stage perfectly. Then she dropped her final card. I have reason to believe, she said, her voice rising with self-righteous triumph, that the man sitting here before you is not who he claims to be. I have spoken with law enforcement, and there are serious suspicions about his past. Do we really want dangerous, unstable people living among our children? The room erupted. Gasps, whispers, even a few shouts. My wife's face went pale. She turned to me, fear flashing in her eyes. This was exactly what I had dreaded. Karen hadn't just crossed the line, she had bulldozed through a dot, and that's when the door at the back of the room opened. 2 uniformed officers walked in. The same ones Karen had called the week before. The same ones who had whispered my name like a ghost from another life. The room fell into a stunned silence. Karen straightened in her chair, smug and expectant. She thought this was the moment I would be dragged out in handcuffs, humiliated in front of the entire neighborhood. She thought she had won, but instead of approaching me, the lead officer turned his gaze directly at Karen. His voice was calm but carried the weight of authority. Ma'am, we've reviewed your claims, he said, and what you've been doing harassing this family, filing false reports, slandering their name stops tonight. Karen's mouth fell open. She stammered, insisting she was protecting the community, that she was doing her duty as HOA president. But the officer cut her off. You see, we know exactly who this man is, he continued, nodding in my direction. And you should be grateful someone like him even chose to live here. Because if you had the faintest idea of the kind of service he's given to this country, you wouldn't be treating him like this, you'd be thanking him. The room went dead quiet. Every head turned toward me. My wife gripped my hand tighter, tears brimming in her eyes. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The truth had been spoken for me. Karen tried to protest, her voice rising in shrill desperation. But the officers weren't done. They reminded her that filing repeated false police reports was a crime, that her harassment bordered on stalking, that the HOA itself could be held liable if she continued her personal vendetta. The color drained from her face. The clipboard, her ever-present weapon, slipped slightly in her grip. For the first time since we'd moved in, Karen looked small. The neighbors' murmurs shifted. Pity turned into shame, frowns into glares. The very people who had once feared or admired her authority now looked at her as if she were toxic. And then it happened. The moment Karen could never recover from. One of the officers leaned close enough for the microphone to catch it, his words echoing through the stunned room. Wait, is that Ghost Viper? The name hung in the air like a thunderclap. Neighbors glanced at one another, confusion written on their faces. They didn't know what it meant, not exactly, but they knew it carried weight. Enough weight to silence Karen completely. I met the officer's gaze and gave the slightest shake of my head. He understood. Nothing more needed to be said. The meeting ended in chaos. Karen tried to gather herself, insisting this wasn't over, but no one was listening anymore. Her power had shattered in front of the very people she'd ruled for years. She left the room red-faced and trembling, the clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield that no longer worked. And as for us, we walked out with our heads high. For the first time since moving in, I felt the crushing weight of her shadow lift from our home. But I also knew this wasn't the end of the story. Because while Karen had been silenced, the echoes of my past were now closer than ever to the surface. And once a name like Ghost Viper is spoken aloud, it can never truly be buried again. The morning after the HOA meeting, the neighborhood felt different. The air was lighter, the silence less suffocating. For the first time since moving in, I could walk outside without feeling eyes burning into my back. The hedges still stood sharp, the lawn still perfectly aligned, but something fundamental had shifted. The queen of the cul-de-sac had fallen, and everyone knew it. Karen's power had vanished almost overnight. The HOA board, those who had once backed her blindly suddenly distanced themselves. Emails circulated about restructuring leadership. Neighbors who had never dared to speak up before began murmuring about replacing her altogether. It was as though the entire community had been waiting for someone to show that she wasn't invincible. But Karen didn't go quietly. For weeks, she tried to cling to the scraps of authority she once wielded. She showed up to houses with violation slips, but now people shut the door in her face. She sent furious emails filled with threats of fines, but the board ignored her. Her clipboard became less a symbol of control and more a reminder of her downfall. Each attempt to reassert herself only fueled the whispers. The president who lost to the new family, the one who called the cops and got humiliated in front of everyone. And then, one day, she was gone. No announcement, no farewell. Her house went on the market, and a for sale sign stood in the yard where she had once patrolled like a guard tower. Some neighbors speculated she had been forced out by the board. Others believed the humiliation had simply been too much. Whatever the reason, the shadow she cast was finally gone. For my wife, it was like a weight lifted from her shoulders. She unpacked the last of our boxes without fear of a clipboard appearing at the window. She planted flowers by the front porch bright, blooms that had never been on any approved vendor list, and laughed as she watered them. The house finally began to feel like a home. As for me, I remained cautious. The officer's words that night still echoed in my mind. Wait, is that Ghost Viper? The neighbors didn't know what it meant, but they knew it was something. And curiosity, I've learned, can be as dangerous as suspicion. At first, there were little things. A neighbor asking casually what I used to do for work. Another pressing a little harder, wanting to know if I'd ever been in the military. I deflected, offering half answers, steering conversations elsewhere. But in quiet moments, I wondered how long the fragile line between my past and present could hold. Then something unexpected happened. Instead of fear or suspicion, I began to notice respect, subtle, unspoken, but present. Neighbors who had once avoided us now waved first. One man offered to help me carry in lumber for a home project. Another asked for advice on securing his backyard shed. It wasn't that they knew the full story, they didn't, but they sensed something. Enough to treat me differently. And maybe, in a strange way, that was okay. Because for all the years I'd spent in shadows, my greatest hope had been to live quietly, to protect the only person who mattered most, my wife. If the fallout of Karen's obsession meant a little Less anonymity, but a lot more peace. It was a trade I could live with. The HOA itself changed too. With Karen gone, the board shifted focus. Rules that once felt like weapons were softened into guidelines. Fines stopped appearing for trivial details. The sense of community, something that had been smothered under Karen's reign, began to breathe again. People gathered in driveways, shared barbecues, even organized a small neighborhood watch, not the weaponized surveillance Karen had run, but a genuine effort to look out for each other. Sometimes I'd catch myself thinking about her, though, wondering if she had ever realized how close she'd come to crossing a line she couldn't return from. She had wanted to expose me, to rip open a life I had built carefully away from the past. But in her arrogance, she had done the opposite, exposed herself instead. And that's the irony of people like her. They think power is in control, in rules, in forcing others to bend. But real power, real strength, is quieter. It doesn't shout. It doesn't need a clipboard. It stands firm when tested and speaks only when the moment demands it. One evening, months later, I sat on the porch as the sun dipped low behind the rows of identical rooftops. My wife brought me a glass of iced tea, the sound of her laughter, still lingering from a call with her sister. For the first time since we moved in, I let myself relax. Karen was gone. The community had healed. And though the name Ghost Viper would always live in the shadows of my past, here, in this quiet neighborhood, I was simply a husband, a neighbor, a man who had chosen peace over war. Still, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. Had Karen pushed further, had she forced my hand, the story might have ended very differently. And perhaps that's the lesson worth remembering for all of us, because sometimes the greatest battles aren't fought on distant soil or in the dead of night. Sometimes they unfold right in our own neighborhoods under the watchful eyes of people who believe a little too much in their own authority. And when they do, you have a choice: to yield, to fight, or to stand so firmly that their power crumbles on its own dot. So tell me this, if you found yourself in our position, would you bow to someone like Karen, or would you hold your ground?